A judge fined Elena Whitaker over a tiny cross necklace in court, but when she stood up and spoke, the entire courtroom fell silent, and even the bailiff was stunned. You won't believe what happened next. Elena Whitaker didn't come to the Jefferson County Courthouse expecting drama. She came to support her younger cousin Jamal, who'd been arrested over a minor traffic stop that had spiraled into something much bigger than it should have been. She took the day off from work, threw on a navy blue blouse, slacks, flats, nothing fancy, just something respectful. Around her neck, she wore a thin gold chain with a small cross. It wasn't flashy, it was barely visible unless you were looking for it. But someone was. The courtroom was packed, a mix of people waiting their turn, lawyers flipping through files, deputies standing silent by the walls. Elena slid into the second row, quiet and calm, her purse folded in her lap. She nodded gently to her cousin, who looked worn down by stress, eyes heavy from lack of sleep. He didn't say anything, just gave her a glance of gratitude. That was enough. Judge Leonard Harper entered with his usual rigid gait. The man had a reputation in Birmingham and beyond. Attorneys whispered about how particular he was. Old school, no nonsense, firm to the point of icy. A Gulf War veteran turned legal mind, he saw the courtroom as sacred ground. His ground. The bailiff called the room to order. Before we proceed, Judge Harper said, scanning the rows like a schoolteacher about to scold someone, I'd like to address a matter of decorum. He looked directly at Elena. You, ma'am, the one in blue, please rise. Elena blinked, surprised, then slowly stood. Her heart thudded a little faster, but she kept her posture straight. You're wearing a religious symbol, he said, voice hard. That's not permitted in my courtroom. Neutrality matters here. I'm issuing a fine of $50 for violating court decorum. The room went quiet. Some people shifted in their seats. Others looked away, uncomfortable. Elena didn't speak right away. She wasn't new to this kind of moment, being publicly singled out, questioned, dismissed. But still, she hadn't expected this. A fine for wearing a necklace? She looked toward the bailiff, then back to the judge. Your Honor, she said calmly, is this a published policy? I'd like to see the statute or court rule that authorizes that penalty. Harper's face didn't flinch. This is my courtroom. I set the rules. Elena nodded slowly. I understand that, sir, but are those rules written anywhere for reference? He stared at her for a long second. You can pay the fine at the clerk's desk or leave. She heard a small gasp from someone a row behind her. Elena didn't move. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue. She just tilted her head slightly and said, I'm not leaving. A man in the front row, an older gentleman in a tan suit, raised an eyebrow. He looked from her to the judge and back again. Curiosity sparked. Harper adjusted his robe. Then you'll be held in contempt? The bailiff shifted on his feet. The prosecutor put down his file. Something was shifting. The air felt heavier, not with drama, but attention. Elena exhaled once through her nose. I'm here to support my cousin, Jamal Thompson. He's being charged today, and he asked me to be present. I'm not here to cause disruption, Your Honor, but I do believe this fine is not only unfair, it may be unlawful. Judge Harper leaned forward slightly. Are you challenging my authority? She didn't blink. I'm asking for clarification on your policy and its legal foundation. He paused. Just for a moment. It was subtle, but it was there, that pause. He hadn't expected that. Who are you? He asked, voice tightening. My name is Elena Whitaker, she replied, and I'm a constitutional attorney licensed in 3 states, including Alabama. The courtroom cracked open. You could almost feel the collective intake of breath. Someone whispered under their breath, Damn, she continued, measured and composed. I graduated from Yale Law School in 2010. I've worked for the Southern Center for Human Rights, and I currently serve as senior counsel at a nonprofit based in Montgomery. I'm here as a family member, but I know the law and I know my rights. Harper leaned back. For the first time, he looked unsettled. Not angry, just off balance. She could have smiled. She didn't. The silence that followed was thick. The judge opened his mouth but closed it again, adjusting the stack of files on his desk instead. But the judge had no idea who he was talking to. Elena didn't grow up with money. She was raised in Mobile, Alabama, in a faded brick duplex off of Dauphin Street. Her mother, Lorraine, worked overnight shifts at a nursing home, and her father left when she was 8. They didn't have much, but they had rules. You speak clearly, you don't shrink yourself, you stand up when something isn't right, but you do it with your head high and your voice calm. By the time she was 16, Elena had read the Constitution front to back, twice. Not for school, just because she needed to understand why people like her were treated differently in courtrooms, offices, stores, even in church sometimes. It wasn't anger that drove her, it was curiosity, and something else too. Something deeper. A quiet fire. People underestimated her all the time, not just in the obvious ways, not just for her brown skin or the fact that she wore her hair natural, but in the way they glanced past her in meetings, the way older male attorneys would call her young lady in a room full of men with thinning hair and fragile egos. She learned early that being brilliant wasn't enough. You had to carry it in silence sometimes. You had to let them think they were smarter until they walked straight into your trap. When Elena got into Yale Law, it didn't even feel like a celebration, more like a confirmation. She had told her high school counselor she wanted to be a civil rights attorney, and the woman laughed, genuinely laughed, before telling her that law school was extremely competitive and not the most realistic path. Elena didn't reply. She just studied harder. At Yale, she wasn't loud. She didn't need to be. She sat in the front row of every constitutional law class, scribbled notes fast, and asked questions that left professors blinking. People started to notice, but still treated her like she was an exception. That never sat right with her. After graduating, she turned down 2 big firm offers. She wanted real cases, real people. She worked in Mississippi for a few years, defending minors caught in the system, then moved to Montgomery to join a nonprofit fighting housing discrimination. She wasn't on magazine covers, no blue check next to her name, but her work got people out of jail. It kept families in their homes. It changed lives. And through it all, she wore that little gold cross. It wasn't for show. It wasn't for anyone else. It had been her grandmother's, passed down with a handwritten note. Wear this when you need to be reminded you're not alone. She never took it off, not once, not even in court. So when Judge Harper singled her out like that, called her out like she was some disruptive teenager in detention, it didn't rattle her. It reminded her of all the times she'd been looked at and not really seen. Because they never expected her. They expected the loud one, the angry one, the one ready to scream or storm out. What they got was different. What they got was precision, control, power and restraint. And it wasn't the first time. Back in 2017, in a courtroom in Jackson, she watched as a public defender stammered through a bail hearing. The judge wasn't listening. The defendant, a 19-year-old accused of trespassing at an abandoned building, was about to be hit with $1,500, 0 cents, bail he couldn't pay. Elena stood up, introduced herself, and cited 3 Alabama statutes that the judge had apparently overlooked. The judge backed down. The bail was waived. The kid walked out the same day. That's who she was. So sitting there in Jefferson County, fined for a necklace that meant everything to her, in front of a judge who thought he could make her sit down and shut up, Elena didn't flinch. She stood straighter. And when she told that courtroom who she was, her name, her credentials, her reason for being there, it wasn't for the judge. It was for everyone who looked at her and thought she was just somebody's cousin. But today wasn't one of those days she could stay quiet. The courtroom stayed quiet longer than it should have. Judge Harper shuffled a few papers like he was buying time, but Elena stood still, hands folded in front of her, waiting. From the far corner, the prosecutor leaned slightly forward, his fingers no longer flipping through his folder. The bailiff's eyes flicked between Harper and Elena. You could feel it. Something had shifted. The authority in the room wasn't resting solely behind the bench anymore. Harper cleared his throat. This court will proceed with the next case. He didn't mention the fine again, not yet. But everyone noticed the silence where his scolding used to be. Jamal's case was called. He stood, still in that rumpled button-down from county lockup. He glanced at Elena, his eyes a mix of pride and worry. She gave him a single, calm look, a look that said, "Don't panic. I've got this." The public defender moved toward the table, but before he could open his mouth, Elena stepped forward. "Your Honor," she said clearly, "with the court's permission, I'd like to represent Mr. Thompson today. I've reviewed the charges and spoken with him. He would like me to stand in his defense." Judge Harper blinked. "You're not on record as counsel." "I have my bar card with me. Alabama license is current. If you'd like to verify with the Board of Professional Responsibility, I'm listed under Elena Joy Whitaker." He hesitated, just a beat too long, then nodded once. "Proceed." Elena stepped next to Jamal. Her cousin looked like he wanted to laugh and cry all at once. She placed one hand gently on his shoulder. As she turned to face the court, Mr. Thompson was pulled over for a non-functioning taillight. According to the arrest report, he was asked to exit the vehicle and was searched without consent. There was no warrant, no probable cause mentioned in the officer's statement. Furthermore, the stop escalated into resisting arrest when he questioned why he was being handcuffed. He never raised his voice. He never threatened anyone. She pulled a document from her purse. "I've submitted a written motion to dismiss, supported by 3 Alabama Supreme Court rulings. Each affirms that a warrantless search under these circumstances constitutes a violation of the Fourth Amendment. Additionally, the resisting arrest charge lacks supporting video evidence, despite officers wearing department-issued body cams." The room was still again. Harper frowned, leaned back, and took the motion from the clerk. He read it. You could see it. His eyes scanning fast, his jaw twitching. Elena didn't speak again. She stood still, giving him room to read, but not enough space to forget her presence. Behind her, people began to shift, not with boredom, but attention. This wasn't the same woman they'd thought was in trouble a few minutes ago. This was someone else entirely. Judge Harper looked up. "You wrote this motion yourself?" "I did. I drafted it last night after reviewing the police report and discussing the arrest with Mr. Thompson." "And you're not with a firm?" "I work with a civil rights nonprofit. We focus on due process violations, housing discrimination, and wrongful convictions." The judge tapped the motion lightly on the desk. "Your client's record, no prior arrests, no violent offenses. He's a full-time electrician's apprentice, just trying to get to work on time the day this happened." Another long silence. Harper finally looked at the prosecutor. "State's position?" The prosecutor hesitated. "We'd be willing to drop the resisting charge, keep the traffic infraction." Elena spoke again, her voice firm. "We'd accept that only with the court's acknowledgement that the search was unlawful. Mr. Thompson deserves that on the record." It was bold. No apology, no fear, just a direct, reasonable request backed by the law. Harper stared at her. The courtroom wasn't used to this. A woman, a black woman, dismantling protocol like it was child's play, but without anger, without ego, just truth. Clear, measured truth. He adjusted his glasses. "Motion granted. Resisting arrest is dismissed. Traffic infraction stands, with a warning, no fines." Elena gave a small nod, no smile, no victory lap. She turned to Jamal. "You're free to go." He didn't move at first, like his body needed to catch up with his mind. Then he stepped out from the defendant's table and gave her a tight hug. People in the courtroom started whispering again, not about the case, about her. But what Elena did next stopped everyone cold. She didn't walk back to her seat. She turned toward the bench, her voice still steady. "Before I sit down, Your Honor, I'd like to formally challenge the fine issued earlier this morning." Harper leaned back, like he'd just been jolted awake. "You want to reopen that matter?" "Yes, sir," she replied. "You stated that religious symbols were not permitted in your courtroom, but unless this courtroom is operating under martial law, the First Amendment is still in effect." She wasn't raising her voice. She didn't need to. In County of Allegheny v. ACLU, the Supreme Court emphasized that government institutions must remain neutral, not hostile, toward religion. Banning a small cross pendant, especially from someone who's not testifying or addressing the court at that moment, isn't neutrality, it's targeted suppression. The gallery had gone completely still. Elena stepped 1 foot forward. "Furthermore, there is no written policy posted, no public signage stating the ban, and no prior warning was given. You fined me without citation, without precedent, and without any attempt to verify my intent or role in the proceedings." Harper shifted in his seat, His face had lost some of its usual control. You could see something moving behind his eyes, calculation, doubt, maybe even shame. "Are you accusing the court of violating your rights?" he asked. Elena didn't blink. "I'm not accusing anyone. I'm stating facts, and I'm asking for the fine to be withdrawn and the court record to reflect that this incident occurred outside proper procedure." The prosecutor looked up briefly, then looked back down. The bailiff's hands were clasped in front of him now, his jaw tight, his stance more formal than before. Harper didn't respond right away. He stared at her for a long, hard moment, and then, "The fine is withdrawn," he said. "It will not appear on record." Elena gave a simple nod. "Thank you, Your Honor." She turned back and walked calmly to her seat. People started whispering again, but this time it wasn't hushed confusion. It was curiosity, respect. A woman behind her mouthed, "Who is she?" to someone else in the row. Elena didn't engage. She just sat, pulled out her notebook and quietly opened it to a blank page. The judge, for the first time all morning, looked like he was really thinking. He moved slower. He reviewed files more carefully. Whatever fire he'd started by fining her for a necklace, it had turned into something else, something heavier. The prosecutor leaned toward the bailiff and muttered something. The bailiff nodded once and scribbled a note on a pad. People were noticing the change. Court resumed. A few more cases were called, but the rhythm was off. The people watching weren't paying attention to the charges anymore. Their eyes kept drifting back to her, Elena Whitaker, the woman who'd corrected a judge without raising her voice. 30 minutes passed. Then, unexpectedly, Judge Harper called for a short recess. He stood up and disappeared through the side door without a word. Elena stayed seated. The bailiff walked toward her slowly. "Ma'am," he said, quieter than before, "can I ask you something?" She turned her head slightly. "Sure. Did you know that was going to happen? With the fine? With all of this?" Elena let out the softest laugh through her nose. "No, I didn't know. But I wasn't going to let it slide." The bailiff rubbed the back of his neck. "I've been here 8 years, never seen him back down like that. He's not a bad man," she said gently, "but power without accountability, that's dangerous." He nodded, not out of obligation, but understanding. Down the hall, 2 court reporters spoke in low voices. The younger one was clearly rattled. She knew every case just rattled them off. "Lawyer? Yeah, from Yale. Can you believe that? Shows up to support her cousin and ends up schooling the judge." They shook their heads. And yet, Elena wasn't glowing with pride. There was no satisfaction in tearing someone down. She wasn't there to embarrass Harper. She just wanted fairness, and when it didn't come, she built it herself, one word at a time. But something deeper began to stir in Judge Harper's eyes. When he returned to the courtroom, something about him had changed. His shoulders weren't as square. He didn't look smaller, just quieter, less like a man trying to hold control, and more like someone trying to understand how he lost it without realizing. He sat down, adjusted his glasses, and called the next case, but even his voice had softened. It was barely noticeable to the average person, but not to Elena. She'd seen this before. Men in power grappling with a truth they didn't want to admit, that they had crossed a line, and someone they didn't expect had pushed back. After court adjourned, as people stood and filed toward the exit, Harper didn't leave the bench right away. He just sat there, looking straight ahead. Elena gathered her bag and was halfway to the door when she heard him say her name. "Miss Whitaker." She stopped and turned, her expression unreadable. He stood now, walking down the steps slowly, as if each one made him think twice. "I'd like a word, if you're willing." The bailiff shifted uncomfortably, unsure if this was an order or a personal request. Elena gave a slight nod, then looked to Jamal. "Give me 5, she whispered to him. Harper didn't take her into chambers. They stood just to the side of the empty courtroom, far enough to have some privacy but still within view. He cleared his throat. "I owe you an apology." Elena didn't answer, not yet. She let him find his words. "I made an assumption," he continued, "an unfair one, about your intentions, about your role. I was wrong." "I'm used to it," she replied softly, but without bitterness. He looked down. "That's the problem, isn't it? You shouldn't have to be—" Silence again. "I've spent 32 years behind that bench," Harper said. and I've prided myself on order, structure, neutrality. But you made me realize sometimes what we call neutral is really just comfortable for the people already holding the gavel. That landed heavier than he expected. Elena just looked at him, steadily, respectfully, no ego, just truth in her silence. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said, "but I'll say this, I won't forget today." Elena gave a small nod. "That's all I hoped for." She turned to leave, but he called after her one last time. "If you're ever back in Birmingham, I'd be honored to hear you argue again." Officially. That part surprised her. "I hope not to need to," she said, half smiling. They both knew what that meant. Outside, the sun had moved higher, and the heat clung to everything. Jamal was standing by the sidewalk, scrolling through his phone. When he saw her, he lit up. "What the hell was that?" he asked, amazed. Elena shrugged, pulling her keys from her purse. "Just a little civics lesson. No, seriously, you shut down a judge in his house." She gave him a look. "Don't romanticize it. I didn't come there to fight, I came to listen. But when somebody tries to shrink you down for something that makes you who you are, you've got two choices: sit still or speak up." Jamal leaned against her car, nodding slowly. "I swear, if I didn't know you better, I'd say you rehearsed that." "I didn't," she laughed, "but maybe I should start writing it down." Just then, a local reporter from the Birmingham Times approached, holding a voice recorder and a notebook. "Ms. Whitaker?" Elena turned. "I watched what happened in there. I think our readers would want to hear your side. Would you be open to an interview?" She glanced at Jamal, then back at the reporter. "Let me think about it." The reporter handed her a card and stepped back. "You made a lot of people think today. That doesn't happen often in court." As they walked to the car, Jamal said, "They're going to talk about this, you know." Elena shrugged again. "Let them." But what happened outside the courtroom mattered just as much. By the time Elena and Jamal pulled into his apartment complex on the west side of Birmingham, his phone hadn't stopped buzzing. Calls, texts, even DMs. A cousin in Atlanta had already heard. A friend from high school sent a screenshot of a local news blog with the headline, "Attorney silently dismantles courtroom bias, judge withdraws fine, dismisses case." Jamal looked at her wide-eyed. "It's already online." Elena smiled faintly. "I told you, people talk, especially when you don't give them the performance they expect." She didn't crave attention. Not now, not ever. But sometimes visibility wasn't a choice. It was a side effect of doing the right thing when you didn't have the luxury of staying invisible. Later that evening, she sat at her kitchen table, sipping tea, the small cross necklace still resting on her collarbone. Her inbox had filled with messages, some from people she knew, others from strangers. A few legal blogs had already posted recaps. Someone on Twitter had clipped part of the live stream footage and added a caption that read, "This is how you correct injustice without ever raising your voice." But Elena wasn't reading any of it. She was thinking about something Judge Harper had said. What we call neutral is really just comfortable for the people already holding the gavel. That had stuck. She remembered being a child, holding her grandmother's hand during evening church service. The pastor had said, "Sometimes the loudest thing you can do is not shout, it's stand." At the time, it sounded poetic, but now it felt real. The next day, she went back to work at the nonprofit office in Montgomery. No one there treated her any differently. There were no welcome back balloons or grand applause, just one of the interns handing her a file and asking if she could look over a housing complaint by noon. She liked it that way. But news still travels, even when you're not the one spreading it. A week later, she got a call from the University of Alabama Law School. They were organizing a community forum on courtroom ethics and bias, and someone on their board had suggested inviting her to speak. She almost said no, almost, but then she remembered that courtroom. The way people's eyes changed once they saw her as more than just someone's cousin. And how many others might still be waiting for someone to speak when they couldn't. She agreed to the forum. 2 weeks after that, a pastor from a church in nearby Tuscaloosa called. He asked if she could come speak to their youth about the law, what it really means, how it protects, how it can be used fairly if people know how to hold it accountable. She said yes. She kept saying yes. Not because she liked the attention, but because the story didn't belong to her anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever sat in the back of a courtroom and thought, "They won't listen to me." She never told Harper this, but that day had changed her too. She thought about him often, wondered if he stuck to that moment in his mind like she did, if he ever looked at someone in his courtroom differently afterward, maybe with more care, maybe with a little more humility. She hoped so. One Friday afternoon she was leaving the office when she spotted an envelope taped to her door. No name, no return address, just her name typed neatly. Inside a short note. "Miss Whitaker, I've revised the courtroom conduct guidelines. Religious attire or symbols, unless disruptive, will no longer be penalized. L.H." There was nothing else. No apology, no signature beyond the initials. But it was enough. She folded the note and slipped it into her grandmother's Bible. But Elena never wanted applause. She just wanted fairness. Some stories grab headlines and vanish within days. Others settle in people's bones and shift the way they see the world, even if they never meet the person who sparked the change. For Elena Whitaker, that courtroom moment wasn't a climax. It was just another chapter in a longer story, one filled with choices that most people never saw, like staying up all night to help a tenant fight an illegal eviction, or taking late-night calls from frantic mothers whose sons were being held without bail, or driving 3 hours to a courthouse in Mobile just to sit in the back and watch a judge she'd heard was mistreating low-income defendants. She never introduced herself. She just watched, took notes, and waited for patterns to reveal themselves. When people asked how she stayed calm, how she didn't snap when someone disrespected her, she'd always answer the same way. "I know what I carry. I don't have to throw it around to prove it's heavy." That courtroom didn't change her. It just reminded her why she chose this work in the first place. Not for glory, not for revenge, for dignity. She didn't want to humiliate Judge Harper. She wanted to make him think, and in that she succeeded. Months later, while speaking to a group of teenage girls at a public charter school in Montgomery, one of them raised her hand and asked, "Weren't you that lady who talked back to the judge and made him look stupid?" Elena smiled. "I didn't talk back. I talked forward. And I didn't make him look stupid. I gave him a chance to rethink something." The girl blinked. "Isn't that the same thing?" "Not even close." A few of them laughed, but one or two really listened. Those were the ones she was speaking to. She went on, "The goal isn't to win arguments, it's to win ground, so the next person doesn't have to fight the same fight. That stayed with them just like it stayed with her. She knew her story might fade from news feeds, the tweets, the blogs, the clipped videos, they'd all get buried eventually. But someone would remember. Someone in the gallery who watched that moment unfold. Someone who'd felt invisible that day and walked out a little taller. That was enough. There are people who walk into rooms and demand to be seen. Then there are people like Elena, who walk in, speak with clarity, and leave the room changed behind them. As for the gold cross, she still wore it every day. And if another courtroom tried to make it a problem, she'd be ready again. Because there will always be someone trying to shrink you to fit their comfort, and there will always be a choice. Shrink or stand, speak or let the silence speak for you. She chose to stand, not with noise, but with knowledge, not with pride, but with purpose. And that's what made people remember, not that she won, but how she did it. The profound lesson from Elena Whitaker's story is the power of standing firm with calm conviction. Her composure in the face of unjust authority teaches us that dignity and knowledge can shift perspectives without aggression. In life, we often encounter moments where we're underestimated or unfairly judged. Elena's choice to speak forward, not back, shows that responding with clarity and purpose can create change, even in rigid systems. This applies daily, whether addressing workplace bias, advocating for fairness, or teaching others to stand tall. True strength lies in carrying your truth quietly but unapologetically, inspiring others to do the same. Her story reminds us that one voice, grounded in principle, can ripple outward, altering perceptions and policies. Thank you for joining this journey. Comment below with your thoughts or how you've stood up for what's right, and subscribe to catch more inspiring stories that spark reflection and action.